I'm quoting Abraham Lincoln in 1859, famous speech of the Wisconsin Agricultural Association. Lincoln said, I call this mudsill theory because he used that term. Lincoln said the British are financing the whole Western movement, and they're attempting to reinstall their class system. And so they send their young sons over to make sure that not a whole lot of attention is paid to ordinary people or people who live in simple homes that have mudsills. He said they're not, according to the British thinking, they're not worth training or worrying about because there's no way they can possibly improve. Lincoln said, look around you. 3/4 of our population has an independent livelihood, and the quarter who doesn't works to put a little stake together to set up on their own and write their own script in life. He said, as a consequence, we don't have proletariat as they do in Britain and Germany and the European nations, and we aren't able to have a factory system where it exists in this country, which is in New England, in the textile industries. A factory will have 30 or 40 employees. They'll usually be young women waiting marriage. They'll be served tea at their machines, and there'll be opera performances staged for just to keep them at the machine, because these independent livelihoods lead to, totally private, independent systems of value. So the British are wrong, but of course the Civil War changed that. We're sold that it was a great crusade against slavery by the school system. The major historians who've turned their attention to that say, to a person, that slavery was already dead. It was staggering through its last couple of generations, not because of a moral transformation on the part of plantation owners, but because the wives of the plantation owners were scratching their head and saying, the husband vanishes for a couple of days. We have all these new slaves, and they're not black anymore. They're various shades of brown. So I'm thinking right now, I think Vern Parrington, but a number of historians 50 years ago said slavery was on its last legs because the Southern womanhood wouldn't stand for it any longer. Russia, I believe, had freed the serfs. Britain and the continent had done this thing. We were going to do it too. But it gave a nobility to the necessity to get rid of the Southern politicians who were trained in dialectical thinking, in rhetoric, and could run circles around the Northern politicians in Congress. They could produce the most compelling arguments for this or that. And so the South had to be gotten rid of.
From my understanding, those dry goods like cotton from the South that were produced by slaves were then going to factories in the North. And the factory owners in the North figured out that the slave owners were paying too much overhead. It cost a lot to keep a whole family fed, et cetera. And there were letters exchanged, and they actually discovered it was cheaper. Why not make everyone a slave who doesn't know that they're a slave?
A wage slave.
Right.
And think only about the welfare idea. If you have a plantation family and you require harmony, even though some people are very subordinate, if somebody gets sick or too old to work, you can't in fact do the Simon Legree bit and get rid of them, or what happens is morale collapses. So you have to care for them. The discussions on the highest level among Northern industrialists, why should we have to support Deadwood here? And we could do that if they were wage slaves. Yeah. And furthermore, people like Count Tolstoy was well aware of the hardcore underneath the romantic arguments, and so were a number of other people. But the public dependent upon media and pulpits, which were subsidized by the owners, they couldn't find a zone where they could think clearly, or someone would say, yeah, here's the truth, think about it.
Early forms of mass media propaganda from the pulpit or the newspaper.
Or the Chautauquas. Sure, right. Oh, absolutely. The Chautauquas were put together by intense, the family that began Harper's Publishers and had the very prestigious journal of the time, Harper's Weekly.
Louis Lapham, the Lapham family.
Well, Lapham's a very latter day.
His grandfather was in charge of Harper's, though, and he was mayor of San Francisco, I believe.
Mayor, he was when the UN came in, and he told me that his boyhood was filled with foreign dignitaries in the home. His house guests were throwing back a glass of wine. So you can actually trace the small number of families behind the Chautauquas, which were the most compelling mass media of the day, and you'd hear about what was going on in Boston, out in Cincinnati, and you'd want that. And selectively, ideas and ways of thinking were introduced to the best people, and they used their local prestige to make sure that, it's a natural process. So what we got was a second American Revolution between 1865 and about 1910. This time the British won again, but they didn't win by force of arms, but by force of insight into the way opinion is created. And when the skilled workers who had intense pride and really were the key to the prosperity of early industrial operation, commercial operation, when the skilled workers understood their power, then industry and commerce were mechanized intensely, and you wiped out the need for skill. You took less quality, but now you had less contention, less argument. Carnegie was instrumental in eliminating the influence of skilled labor, and it continued right through the 20th century.
What influence have the Rockefellers had on organized labor, skilled labor, education?
The Rockefeller family can actually be traced way back in Dutch history. There's an ancestor of the Rockefellers who set up a rather detailed plan for global government hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And that is one of these flow charts that showed how you were going to do that or not. But the great irony, of course, is that Rockefeller and Carnegie's families were fringe people in the United States, but using their brilliant insight into leverage and how it works, both were able to take nothing and pyramid it into quite a bit. Rockefeller actually, his father, I believe, but it may have been his grandfather, fled a rape charge, sort of like Strauss-Kahn's up in Bainbridge, New York. He had been charged with rape of a maid and fled. They threw Rockefeller threw their weight behind, this is emblematic of how they work, behind Horatio Alger, who also had been charged with rape up here in Connecticut, and the Newsboys Lodging House. And if you read a wonderful book that exists, a limited edition, but it's kept continuously in print, called The Rise of the Dangerous Classes in New York City by the creator of American Adoption. When I started to research school, I kept running into the same people who put the adoption institution together and the school institute, one much more important than the other, but still the same names float in and out of one another. Charles Loring Brace, who I believe his father was the publisher of the Hartford Courant. I'm almost sure in his early diaries say, I must find a way to become nationally famous. I mean, in Yale he wrote that. He didn't have any idea how he was going to do that. But finally it occurred to him that with these masses of immigrants being brought in to break the Irish labor monopoly in the mines and the mills, that the easiest way to lower the unit cost of labor was to bring the husband and the wife into the labor force. You double the size of the labor force, you cut the unit value of labor in half. But you couldn't do that as long as they were worried about their kids. So now you have the impetus to enlarge the social work industry, to corrupt the legislatures, to give it the power to break families apart. And what do you do with the kids? Well, the expression put up for adoption tells you you don't want them anywhere in the neighborhood You want them far away. So you put them in boxcars. This great secret, monstrous event in American history that goes on for 40, 50 years. Boxcars full of the children of the labor sent west. They started upstate New York. That was too close. So they kept going farther and farther west. And then they'd stop at a whistle stop, and a platform would be brought out. The boxcar would open. The children would be put up for adoption. They had a preference for who they wanted to adopt. They wanted Lutherans to adopt because they had the Episcopal idea of hierarchy, but they were just dumb farmers. They couldn't think clearly. Here was free labor, hey, and that will end the future career of these immigrants. What stopped putting children up for adoption was the police chiefs of the West. I think the year was 1888, but give me a few years either way. They wrote a stinging attack on this practice, not on moral grounds, but they said crime is everywhere in the West. And if you go to the psychological abstracts, you'll find that an enormous number of adopted children, for example, 6 of the 10 leading mass murderers in American history, but all forms of crime, because when you break the bond with the natural, you can't put substitutes in place. Again, not morally. There's a recent physiological theory called mirror neurons, that you learn to use your own biological equipment by watching people who have the same or nearly identical biological. When you remove that, even if the family that you're transferred to has money and savoir-faire and civil, they're more civil, doesn't matter. You're actually imitating things that your physiology can't accommodate. As a consequence, you get incrementally more and more crazed inside and angry.